Hello and welcome. Within the world of disasters, there are two major groups, natural and technological. Within disasters, there's a failure assigned. The question is to who or what is to blame. For natural disasters, the failure assigned is to the Earth systems, but for technological disasters, whom or what failed is not as easy to point out. The Exxon Valdez oil spill is a technological disaster. Some basics about the disaster are that the oil tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground on Belay Reef within Prince William Sound in Alaska within the early hours of March 24th, 1989. On that night, the tanker was carrying about 53 million gallons of crude oil. Of that, 42 million liters were spilled. An oil spill seems easy to assign failure to either the company who owned the boat or the captain. But looking deeper into the Exxon Valdez oil spill, there are more small failures that did not mitigate the risks associated with the disaster happening, which in terms might have pushed something that could have just been the blip on the monitor to the risk of a catastrophic event. The Exxon Valdez tanker was a single hauled instead of being double hauled. The Exxon Valdez only had one hull between the outside water and the interior hold, where the oil is, where a double hull has the hull of the ship and a tank on the interior that has the airspace between them. The double hull allows for the risk of failure, where a single hull does not. The captain seemed to be the likely person to blame for the spill as he was in charge of the ship at the time, but the failure on his part and the part of the company was much larger than just that. Captain Hazelwood was drunk and had been arrested several times for drinking and driving, but the company gave him another chance following being treated. This was a failure to mitigate risk on both of their parts. Captain Hazelwood was not only drunk, but then he passed command of the ship to the third mate Cousins, while the tanker was making turns to get around the ice well in Prince William Sound. Turning the ship over to the third mate was against regulations, but he wanted to finish paperwork. The captain failed in leaving the third mate in charge. When looking deeper at the disaster, we can see that many failures happened before the tanker hit the reef, allowing the oil to start leaking. The tanker, the captain, and what surrounded had a lack of risk mitigation. The transportation of oil has an inherent risk to it, but not mitigating the risk is dangerous and flirting with disaster. There was a promised plan from the Alaska Pipeline Service Company. This company is simply an agreement between those that held stake within the pipeline and used the terminal facilities. The promise was that within 5 hours of a spill, all needed equipment and trained people would be on scene. Some argued that within 5 hours was still too long. With a promise, there is always a fear of it being broken. When it comes to the Alaska Pipeline Service Company, the promise was broken in 1981 when they started making cuts and no longer having crews on duty 24 hours, instead just calling in it when a spill happened. This was the biggest lack of risk mitigation. They had it in place, but then to save money, they cut it. With the lack of knowledge surrounding the chemical dispersants, there was an attempt to use them to reduce the risk of the oil spreading in the water. Instead, it failed, due to the water being too rough. These failed tests show the lack of knowledge surrounding the mitigation of risk of the oil now being within the water. While the mitigation of risk can be seen before the event that is considered to be the disaster happens, I think that it can also be mitigated the risk of damages following a disaster. Within the Exxon Valdez, there was a plan in place for mitigating the risks, but when the plan was altered, the mitigations of risks were not looked at. The control of the monitoring of the shipping fell to the Coast Guard, which is a government division. To communicate with the Coast Guard Valdez Traffic Center, you had to radio your location in, as well as a harbor pilot would steer the ship through the Narrows, but not all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Both of these were failures to mitigate risk. Once the oil is within the water itself, the cleanup starts. But in the case of the Exxon Valdez, the cleanup itself was a disaster. Alaska Pipeline Company thought it was in charge as it had the cleanup plan that was certified by the state. But Exxon thought that its officials should be in charge. The state also allowed people to be involved. This was the failure to mitigate risk. In 1994, there was a verdict reached for the company of Exxon to pay $5 billion to those who were affected, but as of 2004, there was still a court case going on to fight the verdict. The government failed to mitigate the risks of the court and Exxon having the money to fight payment. The government had failures in many aspects when it comes to the Exxon Valdez oil spill disaster. The failures can be seen in the lack of mitigation of risks surrounding what was allowed to happen within the Sound in relation to transportation communication, those who might be in charge, as well as court cases. The spill and the processes in which were done to clean up the oil impacted those who relied on the waters of the Sound in order to make a living. The lack of livelihood protection is a failure within the government, which is a failure to mitigate risks. Those who relied on the fisheries were known to the government, and not implementing risk management in the cleanup process was a failure. Animals in the ecosystems are those who are impacted greatly by, but almost never protected. The animals in the ecosystem were affected greatly by this spill. Estimates of seabird deaths range from 350,000 to 390,000 and 2,650 otter deaths. The failure here was the lack of risk mitigation for those animals and ecosystems that could not speak for themselves. The mitigation of risks is not just preventing or cleaning up the oil once it's within the water, it's also protecting living things. There are failures surrounding living beings. These failures include court costs, the lack of protection of livelihoods, and for the animals and the ecosystems that had failures to mitigate the risks associated. The mitigation of risk is something that many people have the responsibility to do, but many do not. The failure is not just a single event, and failure does not have to be a large event or have an immediate impact, but the failure being not mitigating the risks associated with something like an oil spill have the result of being a disaster. Failure can be many small things, but all of those small things added up, creating a catastrophic event from a disaster like the Exxon Valdez that could have been easily controlled if the risks were as well. Thank you for watching. Always remember, a disaster is more than just the event itself.